I have kept a ledger at the Marrow Creek livery for 31 years. Every horse in, every horse out. Names if I know them, descriptions if I don't. It is not a thing anybody asked me to do. It is a thing I do because a man needs to believe the world keeps its accounts, even when it plainly does not. There is one line in that ledger I have never been able to read without my throat closing. It is dated the 2nd of October and it says only this: one bay gelding out. Rider, Eli Crane. No return expected. I wrote those last 3 words myself. I had no business writing them. A liveryman records what is, not what he fears. But I had watched a man's whole life come apart in the span of one evening, and I was angry at him, and I wanted the page to say what everyone in town was already saying, that the gambler was finished, that he'd flung away the only good card he was ever dealt, and that Marrow Creek was well rid of him. I was wrong about the no return expected. He came back. 4 years and some months later, on a cold morning that smelled of wood smoke and the first hard frost, a man rode that same bay up the same road, and I did not know him until he was close enough to touch. This is the story of what was lost the night Della Hartwell said no, and what came riding back when nobody was waiting for it anymore. I was there for the leaving and I was there for the return, and I have spent a long time trying to decide which one broke my heart worse. Let me tell you, and you can decide for yourself. The trouble with knowing a man through a card game is that you only ever see the version of him that's winning or losing money. You don't see the rest. So when I tell you that I knew Eli Crane for 6 years before the night he proposed, understand that what I knew was mostly his hands. Good hands. That was the first thing anyone said about him. Long fingers, quiet, never hurried. He'd riffle a deck soft as a man shuffling his own thoughts, and the sound of it would settle a table down the way a low voice settles a spooked horse. He came to Marrow Creek the year the silver played out at Coyle's Claim, which was the year half the saloons closed and the half that stayed open got mean. Eli didn't get mean. That's the second thing people said. He took your money and he poured you a drink with it and he asked after your mother. And you walked home lighter in the pocket but somehow not sore about it, which is a kind of trick I have never understood and never will. I want to be honest with you, because this is a story about a man who learned to be honest the hard way, and it would be a poor thing to tell it crooked. Eli Crane was not a good man those years. He was a charming one, which is a different animal entirely. He drank more than was wise and slept past noon and owed small debts to half the county that he paid back slow, with a wink, as though the owing were a favor he was doing you. He was the kind of man your daughters watched through the window and your wives pretended not to. And the thing about that kind of man is that the whole town builds a little box around him in its mind and writes gambler on the side, and never once thinks to look inside it. Della Hartwell looked inside it. That was the trouble. She ran the boarding house on Quill Street after her husband died of the fever the second winter I knew her. A practical woman. Not soft. I want to correct you before you picture her soft, because every man in Marrow Creek made that mistake at least once and got their hand bitten. She had a way of looking at you that made you check whether your boots were clean. She kept her ledgers tighter than I kept mine. She had a laugh she rationed like good whiskey, and the men who'd earned it from her wore it the rest of the day like a medal. I never knew exactly how it started between her and Eli. I think it was the roof. The boarding house roof went bad in a March storm, and Eli, who owed her 2 weeks' board and a card debt besides, climbed up there in the rain to nail it down because she wouldn't take his money, and he didn't know what else to do with the wanting to give her something. He was up there 3 hours in weather that would have sent a sensible man inside. Came down soaked through and shaking and didn't say a word about it, just handed her the hammer and went to bed. After that you'd see them on the porch some evenings, not talking half the time, just sitting. A man like Eli, who'd built his whole life out of words and the timing of them, to see him go quiet beside a woman content to say nothing, that was the truest thing I ever saw him do. I remember thinking this might save him. I remember being glad. I am an old fool and I was a younger fool then, and I believed, God help me, that love fixed people. That it walked in and swept the old self out like dust. It does not. I know that now. Love does not fix a man. It only shows him very clearly the shape of what needs fixing, and then it stands back and waits to see whether he'll do the work himself. He asked her in October. I know the date because of my ledger and because of what came after. He'd been planning it for weeks. Everybody knew but Della, which is how those things always go. He'd won big off a cattle buyer passing through, won clean, I'll give him that. The man simply could not read a bluff, and instead of drinking it the way the old Eli would have, he'd taken the winnings up to the jeweler in Brannan 2 towns over and come back with a ring in his vest pocket. Showed it to me, actually. Stood right here in the livery with the lantern between us, and opened his hand, and there it was. A small thing. A thin gold band with a stone you'd need to lean in to see. It's not much, he said. It's enough, I told him, because it was, and because his hand was shaking and I didn't want him to see that I'd seen. You think she'll have me, Tom? And here is the part I have never forgiven myself for. I said yes. I said, of course she will, you damn fool, anybody can see it. I said it because I wanted it to be true, and because his face when he asked was so naked with hope that I could not have told him the truth even if I'd known it. I sent him off to that porch with my blessing ringing in his ears. I have thought 1,000 times since about what I should have said instead. I should have said, Eli, a woman like Della doesn't refuse a man because she doesn't love him. She refuses him because she loves him and doesn't trust him, and those are 2 different debts, and only one of them can be paid off in a single night. But I didn't know that yet. I learned it from watching what happened to him. He proposed on the porch at dusk. I have the rest of it second-hand, from the Tilly boy who was fetching water next door and heard the whole thing through the fence, and who told it so many times in the saloon afterward that I finally paid him a nickel to stop. Eli got down on one knee, opened the box, said all the things a man says, and according to the boy he said them plain and shaking, and without a single one of his gambler's flourishes, which is how I know he meant them. And Della Hartwell looked at the ring and looked at the man, and she did not cry and she did not soften. She closed the box gently, closed it with her own hand over his, and she said no. Not a cruel no. The boy was clear on that, and it matters. She didn't laugh and she didn't scold. What she said, near as anyone can reckon, was this, that she had buried one man and would not bury herself alongside another, that she had watched her father drink and gamble her childhood down to nothing, and had sworn she'd never again hand her whole life across a card table and pray it came back. That she did love him, she said that. The boy swore she said that, but that love was not the question. The question was whether she could lie awake every night of her life listening for his step on the stair and wondering which Eli was coming home. And she could not. She would rather keep the wanting of him forever than have him and lose him by inches. Become a man I can count on, she told him, and I will be here. But I will not marry the gamble. I have done that. It cost me everything. Then she went inside and shut the door, and Eli Crane knelt on her porch with an open ring box for a length of time the Tilly boy would not specify. And then he stood up, and he came to my livery. I was banking the forge for the night. I heard the bay before I saw him. Eli's gelding, which I'd shod the week before, has a chip in its near hind shoe that clicks on stone. He came through the door and I turned around and I knew before he opened his mouth. A man's whole body tells you. He was standing the way a building stands after the fire's gone through it, still upright, nothing left inside. Saddle him, he said. Eli. Don't, Tom. His voice was steady. That was the worst of it. I'd have known what to do with weeping. Just saddle him, please. I didn't move fast. I'll confess that. I dragged it out, fussing with the cinch, checking straps that didn't need checking, hoping the time would let some sense leak back into him. The whole while he stood in the doorway looking out at the dark, and the ring box was still in his hand. He never put it away. Held it the way you hold something you've forgotten you're holding. "Where will you go?" I asked. "Anywhere I'm not known." A pause. "Anywhere I can find out if there's anything to me besides the cards." "I want to tell you," I argued. "I want to tell you I grabbed his arm and talked him into staying, because the truth is that if I had, everything after would have been different, and I have to live with that the same as I live with my own knees and my own bad teeth. But I didn't, because a small, ugly part of me agreed with the town. A small, ugly part of me thought maybe she's right. Maybe he is just a gambler, and a gambler is what he'll always be, and better she finds it out tonight than across 20 years. I let that small, ugly thought hold my tongue. So I saddled the bay, and I opened the door, and I watched Eli Crane lead it out into a cold that had teeth in it. At the threshold he stopped. He turned the ring box over once in his fingers. Then he held it out to me. "Keep this," he said. "I can't carry it and I can't throw it away. If I come back," he stopped, "started over. When I find out what I'm worth, I'll come for it. And if I don't come, then it never was worth anything and you can sell it for the price of the gold." I took it. I have it still. It sat in a tin in my desk drawer for 4 years and I never once opened the tin, because I am a coward, and because the day I'd looked inside the ledger box of Eli Crane's life, I had not liked what I learned about my own. He mounted up. The bay's bad shoe clicked on the cobbles once, twice, and then they were on the soft dirt of the road, and there was no sound at all. I went back inside and I opened my ledger and I wrote the line, "One bay gelding out. Rider, Eli Crane." And then, because I was tired and heartsore and angry at him for being the kind of man a good woman couldn't trust, I wrote the 3 words I had no business writing. "No return expected." The lamp guttered. Across town a door was shut that would not open again for a long while, and behind it, I would later learn, a practical woman who never cried was sitting on the bottom stair in the dark, holding her own 2 hands, having just done the bravest and most foolish thing of her life, refused the only man she'd ever wanted, on the gamble that he might come back better. 2 people had each just bet everything on the same impossible card. Neither of them knew the other had done it. Here is a thing nobody tells you about a town. It does not stop for a broken heart. It does not even slow down. The morning after Eli left, the sun came up exactly on schedule, and Mrs. Prout's rooster crowed exactly as loud, and the freight wagon from Brannan came rattling in exactly at 9, and the only sign that anything had changed was an empty chair on the porch of the Quill Street boarding house and 1 extra line in a liveryman's ledger. The world is built that way on purpose, I think. If it stopped every time a heart broke, nothing would ever get done. For a while the town talked. Of course it talked. A gambler runs off after a refused proposal. That's a week of free entertainment in a place where the main amusement is watching the road. The story they settled on was simple, because towns like their stories simple. Della Hartwell had finally come to her senses and thrown over the card sharp before he could ruin her, and Eli Crane had slunk off to gamble himself into a ditch somewhere, and good riddance, and wasn't it always the way with that kind of man? I let them say it. I knew better, or thought I did, but I let them say it, because correcting a town is like correcting a river, and because, again, the small, ugly part of me wasn't sure they were wrong. Della never said a word, not one. She opened the boarding house the next morning at the usual hour and served the usual breakfast and kept her usual books, and if you didn't know her, you'd have thought nothing had happened at all. But I knew her a little, and I saw the things the town didn't bother to. I saw that she stopped sitting on the porch in the evenings. I saw that, when the freight wagon came rattling in at 9, she would find some reason to glance up the road behind it, just a flick of the eyes, there and gone, every single morning for longer than you'd credit. I saw that the laugh she used to ration got rationed tighter, until a whole season might pass without anyone earning it. Once, this was maybe 2 months on, I had cause to bring her a horse a boarder had left in my care, and she came out to the gate to take it, and she looked at me for a moment too long. And I understood that she wanted to ask me something and could not make herself do it. I could have spared her. I could have said, "He gave me the ring to keep, Della. He said he'd come back when he found out what he was worth." It would have cost me nothing, and it might have given her something to hold on to in the dark. I said nothing, because I had promised Eli I'd keep it, and because I am, as I keep telling you, a coward, and because some misguided notion of loyalty told me it wasn't my secret to spend. I have turned that moment over 100 times. I think now I was wrong. I think she'd have carried the waiting easier if she'd known she wasn't waiting on nothing. But I didn't tell her, and she took the horse, and she went back inside, and the gate clicked shut, and that was that. Word of Eli came in scraps, the way news did in those days, carried by freight men and cattle drovers, and the occasional letter passed third hand. And the scraps, I'll tell you plainly, were bad at first. He'd been seen in Caldwell, drunk and losing. He'd been seen in a railhead town further west, in a card game that ended in a fight, though nobody could say which side of it he'd been on. There was a rumor he'd been shot. There was a rumor he was dead. Each one of these came to me through the livery, where all the news of a town pools eventually, and each one I received with a sick lurch and then a kind of bitter vindication. See, he was always just a gambler. The leaving didn't change him. Nothing changes a man like that. I am ashamed of how much I wanted to be right about him. I think wanting to be right about other people's failures is one of the meanest hungers a person carries, and I carried a bellyful of it that first year. Then the scraps changed. It was the drover Hollies who brought the first one that didn't fit the story. He'd come through a town called Esperance, away down south near the territory line, and he'd mentioned Marrow Creek over a drink, and a man had said, "Marrow Creek, say, you know an Eli Crane." And Hollies, expecting a tale of a card cheat run out on a rail, was surprised to hear something else entirely. The Eli Crane in Esperance, the man said, had hired on at a horse outfit. Worked the worst jobs, the breaking and the doctoring, the ones nobody wanted. Didn't drink. Didn't play. There'd been a card game got up one night in the bunkhouse, and this Crane had stood and walked out of it like the deck was on fire. Couldn't be the same man, Holly said to me, half a question. No, I agreed, couldn't be, and I went home and didn't sleep. Because here is what I understood, lying awake that night, that I had been too small to understand before. It is one thing to quit the cards when there are no cards. Any man can be sober in an empty room. But to sit down in a bunkhouse where the deck is already cut, and the chips are already stacked, and the men are already laughing, to feel the old pull come up through the floor and into your hands, the riffle and the odds and the lovely terrible certainty of it, and to stand up and walk out into the dark instead, that is not a man who has stopped gambling. That is a man fighting for his life every single day, and winning with nobody watching, for no reward he can see. I thought about the night I'd let him ride out. I thought about the 3 words in my ledger, and for the first time it occurred to me that I might have written them not because I knew him, but because I didn't. The years went by the way years do, which is slowly and then all at once. Della kept the boarding house. She turned down 2 other men in that time, a widowed rancher with good land and a deacon from Brannan with better, turned them both down kindly and firmly, and the town clucked over it and called her hard, and I knew, I alone in all of Marrow Creek knew, that she wasn't hard at all. She was waiting. She'd told a man to come back better, and then she'd done the only thing she could do, which was to keep her own promise by staying, by being there, in case the unlikeliest thing in the world should come true. She didn't know about the scraps of news. I never told her the bad ones to spare her, and I never told her the good ones, because I was afraid to be the one who lit a hope that might still burn her down. I see now that I'd appointed myself the keeper of both their hearts, and then served neither of them, out of an excess of caution that was really just fear in its Sunday clothes. There is a particular kind of harm that careful, frightened people do to the brave ones around them, and I did it to those 2 for years, and called it minding my own business. The good scraps kept coming, though fewer but steadier. Crane had taken over the breaking string at the Esperance outfit. Crane had pulled a boy out of a flooded crossing and near drowned doing it. Crane had been offered a foreman's job and turned it down, and when asked why, had said he had business north he meant to finish first. Business north. I held onto those two words like a coal in winter. And then, the fourth autumn, the news stopped. No scraps at all. A silence that could have meant he'd died or could have meant he'd simply dropped out of the paths the news traveled. I told myself the second thing and feared the first, and the days got shorter and the mornings got cold, and the first hard frost came and silvered the whole valley one night so that I woke to a world gone white and brittle and strange. I went down to the livery early that morning to break the ice on the troughs. The cold was the kind that gets into your fillings. Wood smoke hung over the town in flat blue layers. I had a bucket in each hand and my breath in front of my face, and I was thinking about nothing at all, about ice and old bones, when I heard it. A sound I'd have known in my sleep. A sound I had not heard in 4 years and some months. The click of a chipped horseshoe on frozen stone. Near hind, click, click. I set the buckets down very slowly. I turned around, and up the white road, out of the blue smoke and the low cold sun, came a man on a bay gelding, riding easy in no hurry at all, and I did not know him. That's the truth of it. I stared straight at a man I'd grieved for, and I did not know him until he was close enough to touch, and even then it was the horse I recognized first, and the man only after by his hands. He'd gotten older, which we all had, but it wasn't the years that fooled me. It was the way he sat the horse. The Eli Crane who'd ridden out of my livery 4 years before had carried himself like a man perpetually halfway through a bluff, light, quick, ready to be liked, ready to bolt. There was a kind of held-breath quality to him always, a sense that the charm was a hand he was playing and might fold at any moment. The man on the bay had none of that. He sat the way the old drovers sit, the ones who have spent more nights under the sky than under a roof, settled, unhurried, taking up exactly as much room in the world as he meant to and not 1 inch more. His hands on the reins were still and brown and scarred across the knuckles in a way they hadn't been. A breaking string will do that to a man's hands. So will 4 years of work. He drew up in front of the livery and looked down at me, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. Our breath went up together in the cold. "Tom," he said finally. "Eli," my voice came out rusted. "You're older. You're not the only one." And then, because I am who I am, because 31 years of recording arrivals had worn a groove in me too deep to climb out of, I said the thing I'd been saying to writers for 3 decades, the most foolish possible thing to say to a man come back from the dead. I said, "How long are you staying?" He almost smiled. I saw it start at the corner of his mouth and decide against itself. "That's not up to me," he said. "It's up to her." We stood in the livery and I made coffee on the forge fire, and we did not talk about much of anything for a while, which I have come to understand is how men talk about everything. He told me about the horse outfit. He told me about the boy in the flood, told it plain, no flourishes, made it sound like nothing, which is how I knew it had been everything. He asked after people. He listened more than he spoke. The old Eli had been a man who filled a silence. This one let silences stand, and there was a weight to him in them, a kind of earned stillness. Finally, I could not hold it any more. I went to my desk and I opened the drawer and I took out the tin, and I opened the tin, the first time in 4 years I'd opened it, and there was the ring box, exactly where I'd put it, the gold band and the small stone you had to lean in to see. I held it out to him. "You said you'd come for it," I said, "when you found out what you were worth." He looked at it a long time. He didn't take it right away. When he did, his scarred hands were not quite steady, and I was glad of that, glad there was still something in him that the work hadn't made calm, because a man should tremble a little before the biggest moment of his life, or what's the use of being alive at all? "I don't know what I'm worth, Tom," he said quietly. "That was the wrong question. I spent the first year out there trying to answer it and near drank myself dead doing it." He turned the box over in his fingers, the old gesture, the one habit that had survived. What I found out instead was, I found out I could stand up. From the table. I found out there was a man in me who could stand up and walk out the door, and I'd never met him before because I'd never once given him the chance. He closed his hand around the box. I'm not coming back to her to say I'm worth her. I'm coming back to say I'm willing to spend the rest of my life proving it, one ordinary day at a time. And that's all I've got to offer, and it might not be enough. And I'd rather hear her say no to this man than have spent my life wondering. I want you to understand that I had spent 4 years quietly certain I knew how this would go. I'd built 2 endings in my head and kept them both ready. In one, Della took him back and they were happy and the town learned a lesson about judging a book by its cover. In the other, he came back too late, or too changed, or she'd hardened past reaching, and he rode off again and I had to write a worse line in my ledger than the first one. I am here to tell you that the truth was neither, and that the truth was better than my poor imagination, and that I have stopped, since that morning, believing I know how anything will go. He went to the boarding house on foot, left the bay with me, said he wanted to arrive the way he should have left, slow and on his own 2 feet with nothing to bolt on. I did not go with him, of course, but the boarding house is up the rise from the livery, and the air that morning was so cold and clear that sound carried strange and far, and I will not pretend I didn't stand in my doorway and watch the whole of it, because I had earned that much, I think, after 4 years of keeping their ring in a tin. She was on the porch. She'd taken to coming out in the mornings again that last year. I'd noticed it and not let myself wonder why. She was wrapped in a gray shawl with her breath in front of her, and she had a cup in her 2 hands, and she was looking, the way she looked every single morning, up the road behind where the freight wagon would come. And he came up the road instead. I was too far to hear the words. I am glad of it now. Some things shouldn't have a witness, and I'd witnessed enough of those too for one lifetime. But I saw the cup come down from her face. I saw her go very still, the particular stillness of a person who has rehearsed a moment 10,000 times and finds the real thing has stolen all her lines. I saw him stop at the bottom of the porch steps, not climb them, just stop, the way a man stops at the edge of a thing he has no right to assume, and I saw him take off his hat. And then I saw her set the cup down on the porch rail, very carefully, the way she did everything, careful and practical and brave. This woman who never cried and never softened and had bet 4 years of her one life on a man's chance of becoming someone he'd never been. She came down the steps. I turned around and went back inside my livery. Then, because the rest was theirs and not mine, and because my eyes had gone and betrayed me in a way they hadn't in 31 years of recording who comes and who goes. I'd like to tell you they married within the month, and it was the finest wedding Marrow Creek ever saw, and maybe they did and maybe it was. I'd like to tell you he never gambled again as long as he lived, and stayed a good man and a steady one to the end of his days. But I've learned my lesson about endings, and I won't pretend I know the whole of theirs. A man who's fought a thing that hard doesn't get to set it down forever and walk away clean. He gets to fight it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the standing up is never finished, only renewed. There were surely hard nights ahead for both of them. The work of being worth someone's trust is not a thing you complete. It is a thing you do, and keep doing in the dark with nobody watching, for a reward you have to take mostly on faith. What I know is this. I went back to my desk that morning, and I took up my pen, and I opened the ledger to the page from 4 years and some months before, and I read the line I'd had no business writing. 1 Bay gelding out, rider Eli Crane, no return expected. I did not cross it out. A liveryman doesn't erase what was. The fear had been real and the page should keep it. Instead, I turned to the new page, the present one, and in my best hand, the hand I save for things that matter, I wrote the truest line I have ever recorded in 31 years of recording.